I decided for personal reasons not to attend COP26 this year. However, in two recent interviews with European journalists and on a panel this week at the Caribbean Renewable Energy Forum, I was asked to reflect on the progress that had been made since COP21 in 2015. I responded that it was heartening to see 1.5 degrees Celsius now accepted and referenced in all news reports as the long-term temperature goal. When we went to COP21, very few people outside of the Alliance of Small Island States thought there was any chance of seeing 1.5 degrees Celsius in the text of the Paris Agreement. When the final text of the agreement came out, and Article 2A contained the words, holding the increase in the global temperature to well below 2 degrees Celsius above pre-industrial levels, and pursuing efforts to limit the temperature increase to 1.5 degrees Celsius above pre-industrial levels, we were told that we had pulled off a negotiating miracle. I remember the then European Commissioner for Energy and Climate Action saying to me, just before the High Ambition Coalition made its triumphant entry into the plenary room at Le Bourget, where sometime later Laura Fabius would gavel the Paris Agreement into existence, Fletcher, you and your small islands have pulled off a coup. So today, 6 years later, to see that 1.5 degrees Celsius is the only goal that is spoken about is very encouraging. However, sad to say, this is where the good news ends. The walk has not matched the talk. Every year since 2015 has brought new, bad climate records. We have continued to pump more carbon dioxide, methane, and nitrous oxide, the so-called greenhouse gases, into our atmosphere. Global land and sea temperatures have continued their relentless increase. Ice melt at our North Pole is taking place at an alarming rate, exceeding the predictions of the desktop models. Our oceans are becoming more acidic because they are being forced to absorb more carbon dioxide. Droughts and deadly forest fires are becoming commonplace in some parts of the world. Frequent flooding is destroying lives and livelihoods in others, and the impacts of climate change on health, food security, water security, and economic stability are becoming more severe. Since the adoption of the Paris Agreement in December 2015, the G20 countries have provided more than $3.3 trillion in subsidies for fossil fuels, the same fossil fuels they have promised to phase out to allow us to get to the 1.5 degrees Celsius goal. Since the beginning of the COVID-19 pandemic in January of last year, governments in G20 countries have committed at least $238.4 billion to oil and gas, and another $46.5 billion to coal. In other words, while small island developing states and other climate vulnerable countries have been fighting to keep their populations alive and their economies afloat during the COVID-19 pandemic, the rich industrialized nations have pumped $275 billion into subsidies for fossil fuels. So I hope you can forgive my pessimism when I say the walk is not matching the talk. The recent assessment report of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change painted a very scary picture for our planet. It showed that in all but one of the scenarios, we would exceed the 1.5 degrees Celsius temperature goal. That report showed that while the 1.5 degrees Celsius goal was still reachable, it would take commitments and actions on a scale we have not seen so far. The Emissions Gap Report of the United Nations Environment Programme, which was released earlier this week, shows that the existing pledges in Nationally Determined Contributions, or NDCs, which are the reporting instruments used by the countries that signed on to the Paris Agreement, will get us to no better than a 2.7 degrees Celsius increase. When we factor in the net zero pledges that have been made recently, many of which are not anchored in legislation, we can shave an additional 0.5 degrees Celsius off the expected long-term warming. In other words, the best effect of the NDCs and net zero pledges that are currently on the table will be global warming of 2.2 degrees Celsius. While some would like us to believe that that is progress, it is not what we need. Far from it. For small island developing states, global warming is not an academic discussion about gigatons of carbon dioxide equivalents. It is an existential issue. Each fraction of a degree over 1.5 degrees Celsius will cause serious impacts for us. Loss of biodiversity, sea level rise that will inundate coastal communities, more days of extreme heat, longer periods of severe drought, stronger hurricanes, and greater likelihood of bushfires, to name but a few. Our planet is a living system, which itself sustains other living systems. A fever in a human being is a sign of illness, and if left untreated, it can lead to organ damage and death of the individual. Our planet is no different. If this global fever is allowed to continue unabated, species will become extinct, ecosystems will be seriously threatened, and the environment in which human beings live will become more unbearable and treacherous. The climate change impacts will take an immense toll on our economies, which are already reeling from the devastating effects of COVID-19. We are currently struggling to keep our national economies afloat. When Hurricane Maria struck Dominica, it caused damage equivalent to 226% of that country's GDP. Hurricane Irma caused destruction that exceeded 300% of the GDP of the British Virgin Islands. Climate change will cause more of these severe hurricanes. For developing countries to adapt to the myriad devastating impacts of climate change, the United Nations Environment Programme has estimated that they will need $70 billion annually right now, which will increase to between US $140 and $300 billion annually in 2030, and between $280 and $500 billion annually in 2050. When you add the cost of responding to irreversible loss and damage from extreme weather events, sea level rise, ocean acidification, the estimate for the cost of our response in this decade approximates $1 trillion. Now, as large as this figure sounds, it is less than 1/3 of what the developed countries have paid out in subsidies to the fossil fuel industry since the adoption of the Paris Agreement 6 years ago. Developed countries made a pledge to mobilize $100 billion annually in climate finance for developing countries by 2020. While they have reported providing an average of $59.5 billion per year in climate finance, Oxfam has shown that when loan repayments, interest, and other forms of over-reporting are removed, the true value of the financial support may be as little as between $19 and $22.5 billion per year. To add insult to injury, 80% of all reported public climate finance was provided as loans. In other words, we, the countries that are the victims of a climate catastrophe we did not cause, are being asked to borrow money from the same countries that caused the crisis in order for us to respond to the crisis. Even more egregiously, Oxfam estimated that only 3% of the climate finance that was disbursed has been disbursed to small island developing states. The window for taking action to reduce the impacts of climate change and to restrict global warming to no more than 1.5 degrees Celsius is closing quickly. Unfortunately, many of the countries that are in a position to keep 1.5 alive have shown weak ambition to do so. Moreover, the levels of climate finance that are needed to help the victims of climate change adapt and strengthen the resilience of their societies and economies are not forthcoming from the developed countries. A recent report by the BBC revealed that some of the major greenhouse gas emitting countries have been lobbying the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change to water down the conclusions of its last assessment report, to minimize the need to transition away from fossil fuels and the importance of making finance available to developing countries. COP26 cannot be another COP of pledges and commitments. It cannot be another talk COP. COP26 must be a COP of bold, ambitious action at a scale we have not seen before. It must be the walk COP. Our CIS negotiators have a proud history of being the most committed, knowledgeable, and indefatigable team of negotiators at COPs. They routinely punch well above their weight and achieve outcomes that belie the size of their delegations and the resources at their disposal. Once again, they have a tough uphill fight on their hands. In whatever way we can, we need to rally to their cause and give them the support that they will need to fight for small island developing states. We need to amplify our voices for climate action. and for climate justice. The survival of our citizens, our brothers, and our sisters depends on it. This really is a life and death issue.